war against Iran. So as I began to explore, and I was always interested in the Kennedy assassination, being interested in politics, I suddenly began to see that in all the published works on the Kennedy assassination, there was never anything mentioned about JFK's war with Israel. And what is even more interesting, I think, and I'm sure the listeners of RBN will appreciate this, in all of the mass media in America, John F. Kennedy was always presented as a strong and dear friend of Israel. That they tell the old myth that John F. Kennedy was the first president to really become a friend of Israel. They talk about how John F. Kennedy sent Israel weapons. What they don't mention, of course, is the fact that the reason why JFK sent Israel conventional weapons was because Israel was blackmailing him and saying, you know, if you don't send us conventional weapons, we're going to build nuclear weapons. But, of course, they intended to do it anyway. Well,
Michael, if I could, just to give Eric fair time here, you know how the breaks work. We got this about gives it even time. Then after the other break, we got about 4 minutes. So you'll each get 2 more minutes after that to explain yourself and how you got involved in looking at the truth. So I'm going to turn this over to my next guest, Eric John Phelps, author of Vatican's Assassins. And I think, like I said with Michael, I think our listeners would like to know, Eric, how you first got involved in seeking the truth and finding the real enemies within. How are you?
Very good, thank you. I was first stimulated to this topic when I was 10, when Kennedy was assassinated. I was in the 4th grade. I remember the day very vividly, and that had a lasting effect on me. The second issue was when I was in Bible college, I was exposed to the Jesuit hand in the assassination of Lincoln. I had a professor, Dr. Rember Carter, who had a whole class on. He was an Edinburgh graduate, has a PhD in history, and I was quite shocked. So then I began to check that out at length. And then the final issue was the issue of the Reformation Bible. The King James Bible was being supplanted by all these other versions, which I at the time did not know that there was a completely different Greek text underlying all these new versions, specifically the NIV, NASB, and others. So it was those 3 issues that really stimulated me to go back and study the Kennedy assassination and the authors that I began to trust the most, being Jim Marrs, Mark Lane, Fletcher Prouty, and a couple of others.
Okay. Would you like to continue, or is that all you'd like to say about your beginnings?
Sure. That's pretty much about the beginnings.
Okay. Well, listen, that was quick. Why don't we get to this next question? I want to ask both of you this, and we can start off with Michael. Historically, Michael, you know, how have the Zionists come to power, and what has your research found?
Well, you know, when you consider Zionist power in America, and I'd like to focus on that because, you know, we should define the term Zionist first of all.
That's fine. Go ahead.
There are some people who use the term Jewish and the term Zionist interchangeably, and those terms are not interchangeable. Now, for example, Eric just mentioned my good friend Mark Lane, who inspired him to do research into the JFK assassination. Mark Lane was born into a Jewish family, but he is outspokenly anti-Zionist. He is a very big critic of Israel. And that is a good example right there of someone who, although they are of Jewish descent, they definitely can most certainly not be called a Zionist. Zionism is Jewish nationalism, the desire to have a Jewish state. And, of course, in 1948, there was a Jewish state established in Israel. Now, if you look at Jewish power in America prior to the establishment of the Zionist state of Israel, you'll find that it was, in fact, quite substantial, beginning roughly in the 1850s and 1860s. But by the 1880s and 1890s, it was quite substantial. So discussion of Jewish power is something that's entirely different from Zionist power. I would say, though, that the fulfillment of absolute Zionist control, or at least the move towards fulfillment of control, came on November 22nd, 1963, when the last American president to stand up to the Zionist lobby in Washington, John F. Kennedy, was killed. And after that, there was a 180-degree turnabout in U.S. foreign policy. The United States allowed Israel to develop nuclear weapons. It began massive shipments of taxpayer-based foreign aid funds and also military support to Israel. And in subsequent years, the Zionist lobby in Washington continued to increase its power. I think what's most telling about Zionist power in America is that you cannot discuss it. You are not allowed to openly discuss it, else your heads will be cut off. But it's very interesting. Just a couple years ago in the Washington Post, which is a powerful newspaper, which, needless to say, is part of the American establishment, really the international establishment, they actually had a headline story on one of the inner pages saying that that many people were concerned that there were too many Catholics on the Supreme Court. Now, I can't imagine the Washington Post ever having a story saying that there were too many too many Jews on the Supreme Court, or too many Zionists on the Supreme Court. So I would say that the assassination of John F. Kennedy laid the groundwork for the rise of Zionist power, solidified it here in Washington. But George W. Bush, with his determination to place all these hardline, fanatic Zionist extremists in positions of influence, has really solidified their power in this country. And God bless us all, because the plans they have for this world are very destructive.
Okay, the break's coming on here, and I want to just mention, if you guys, while you're talking, I'm going to let Eric speak after the next break, and I'm going to ask him the same question. But in the second half hour, when I ask the question, if you guys want to ask a question while the person's talking, please, ask me, and then we'll do that without interrupting to make it a little bit more stimulating. We're going to be back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
Washington, walk till peace has come.
Okay, we are back. The great debate here on the Investigative Journal, and America deserves answers. Who are the real enemies? Author Michael Collins Piper believes it's the Zionists. He explained what the term Zionism means and how they came to power briefly. And now we're going to ask that same question to author Eric Phelps. He wrote Vatican Assassins. He believes it's the Jesuits. Eric, how did they come to power?
How did the Zionists come to power?
No, the Jesuits.
The Jesuits. The Jesuits were created as a result of the Protestant Reformation, and they were formally created or chartered by Pope Paul III in 1540. And their purpose was to destroy the Protestant Reformation and bring all the nations back that had separated from the temporal power of the Pope to the Pope's spiritual and temporal power. They also were created, which I just recently learned, to do war with the Saracens, to go to war with the Muslims of the Middle East. So they were created for this purpose, and as they had their constitutions that were written, they had their secret instructions, they set out to regain the world for the Pope. What the Pope did not know is that the Jesuit order is an order completely within and of itself, and that it has its own agenda. And for 2 centuries, they began to amalgamate all their power into their hands. They were behind assassinations, regicides, usury. They were ultimately suppressed from France, Portugal, Spain, and all their holdings in South America. They were sent back to Civitavecchia, and they were ultimately suppressed with the papal bull Dominic Ac Redemptor Noster in 1773 by Pope Clement XIV. As a result of that, the Jesuits launched and waged the French Revolution. They punished all the monarchs of Europe that had suppressed them, including the Knights of Malta, drove them from their islands, confiscated all their treasures and weapons to conduct a crusade into Egypt to kill the Mamelukes that were protecting the Egyptian caliph there. In 1814, the Jesuits were revived after Napoleon deliberately betrayed his army, sacrificed it at Waterloo. And then from there on, the Jesuits have sought complete and total control over the papacy, which really culminated in 1870 with Vatican I and the doctrine of papal infallibility. By centralizing all power in the Pope, they could then control the entire Roman Catholic hierarchy and institution through that one man of theirs.